Welcome to Nutanix Sales Strategy and Competitive Differentiation. In part 2, we're going to take a look at how to conduct proper discovery. Upon completion of this session, you will gain some tips on how to sleuth out who you may be competing against and understand how to do proper discovery with both the emotional, technical, and logical or economic buyers. So let's take a look at how to do proper discovery. So when we head into a customer meeting, we want to be able to easily determine whether we're dealing with the emotional or technical buyer, or the logical or economic buyer, or both. And depending on who's in that meeting, we're going to have a very different conversation. Sometimes we may be able to focus the conversation on just flushing out operational pain. Sometimes that's going to be focused in on flushing out business pain. But if both of those buyer personas are in the same meeting, then we're going to have to actually address both of those at the same time. It's also fundamentally important that you identify up front who the incumbent solution vendors are and then who our potential competition is going forward. It's very difficult to set the appropriate traps if we don't know who our competition is. So how do we figure out who our competition is? Well, sometimes we can just go and ask the customer and they're going to openly tell us. Other times they're going to be pretty secretive against who we're competing against. So here's a little bit of a cheat sheet to be able to kind of sleuth out who we might be competing against. If we know that the customer is a VMware customer and they're looking at us, there's a pretty good chance that they're also looking at vSAN. If it's a Dell EMC customer, then it may be vSAN disguised as VxRail. And so in these conversations, an interesting way to kind of tell things out are if you are having a conversation around ES6i as a hypervisor and there's not really a lot of interest in talking about AHV, then you know you're probably dealing with some VMware ES6i fanboys. If anything comes up around, in-kernel versus CVM, or the overhead associated with CVM, or convoluted I/O paths, or those types of things, those are all kind of standard FUD items that VMware is going to feed those customers, so you know pretty good idea that you're up against vSAN. The other interesting thing is there's a tremendous amount of vSAN attached to HPE Synergy. So if you're up against HPE Synergy, you might think that you're up just against hardware, but there's a pretty good chance that you're actually also up against vSAN. A couple of other things to kind of note in terms of determining whether it's vSAN or VxRail. On the Dell side, there's a lot more focus in on actual hardware. So if there's a lot of conversations around supporting latest and greatest hardware with hyperconverged, then you might be up against Dell. And the VxRail messaging also is focusing in on kind of extended hardware software one-click updates, as well as a single unified engineered solution with a single point of contact for support. So if any of those types of conversations, there might be an indication that you're up against VxRail. If you're going into an environment where Cisco is the incumbent vendor and their current UCS customer, then there's a pretty good chance that they might also be looking at HyperFlex. In fact, in a lot of cases, Cisco may have already even dropped off a bunch of free HyperFlex nodes. Now, if you have any kind of objections around, like, does Cisco support Nutanix? What is our story around integrated networking? Can we independently scale compute and storage resources? Anything around kind of modern log structured file systems or being able to automatically deploy remote systems? Those are all indications that you might be up against HyperFlex because that's part of the core messaging and that's part of the stuff that they feed customers to ask us questions and object. Now, if you're in an environment where HPE is the incumbent, then there's a pretty good chance that they might be looking at SimpliVity. SimpliVity's messaging hasn't really changed for 4 or 5 years. It's all going to be focused around things like integrated backup, throw away your third-party backup vendors, these massively insane and overinflated data efficiency numbers due to the dedupe card, objections around what happens when 2 disks fail in a Nutanix environment, any talk around built-in WAN optimization, rapid DR or built-in DR orchestration, or anything around things like hyper guarantees or asking about whether we have guarantees against our system. Those are potential indicators that you're up against HPE SimpliVity. So that should give you a pretty good idea on what to listen for and just the little keywords and things that might give you an indication of who you're competing against. So when you have that first call meeting with the customer, if they have absolutely no idea who Nutanix is and what we do, then you're probably going to want to start with some basic information that will give them an idea of what we're actually talking to them about. But I highly recommend that you don't go through and do kind of a pitchy first call deck. start that conversation with asking them about what's going on within their environment and what kind of pain they have and those types of things. And I recommend you doing that as kind of a rep SE tag team at the whiteboard. So the first thing that you want to discover early on in the meeting is who's actually in the meeting. And so in this particular example, we've got some infrastructure administrators, some storage administrators, and then some team leads for those. So it doesn't really look like we have any type of logical or economic buyer or decision maker in the meeting. These are purely the technical folks. So we're going to have a conversation around discovery for an emotional or technical buyer. And so as you start talking to these guys and as you start probing questions, the story of what's going on in their environment should come out. And so let's go through an example of this. So this particular customer was talking about just having way too many different storage vendors. They've got all these different point storage solutions for particular applications or particular storage protocols to support those applications. This is a huge pain for them. There's a lot of underlying complexity within that environment. They've had some staff that have actually left that were subject matter experts in some particular storage arrays, and they've had other staff that have had to go and now pick up the skill set to be able to go and manage and administer those arrays. And it's been pretty difficult for those folks to kind of keep their skills up to date. They're spending a lot of time coming in evenings and weekends to deal with a lot of issues or do patching and upgrades. They have a whole series of different branch offices. The infrastructure in those branch offices is now aging and kind of always failing. So continually having to go out to those branch offices and deal with failure events, further contributing to a lot of time they're spending on evenings and weekends. Because they have all these different silos of infrastructure, they really don't have any visibility into what the free capacity across their system is. And so they'll have a particular storage array that runs out of capacity, and maybe they have other storage arrays that still have capacity, but it's kind of stranded and they're not able to utilize it without shifting workloads around and those types of things. And so that results in basically this pure reactionary fire drill event where now they have to go and address that capacity issue. They maybe didn't identify that earlier, so there's no planned budget to replace that. So it's very much a pure reactive type of scenario. They have developers within their environment, and much like every developer team, these guys want infrastructure on demand. They snap their fingers, they expect infrastructure to show up, they expect to be able to deploy VMs and containers and applications. And this particular administrator team is way behind in weeks to months. So the developers have basically seen them as a blocker to them being able to do what they want to do. And so they basically have now started bypassing IT. There's very little automation in the environment. There's still a ton of very manual processes. These are very time consuming. They'd like to be able to automate, but they actually don't have time to be able to invest in automation. You can usually flush out some pain around the various different vendors that they have in the environment and how calling into those support organizations is a really negative experience. So I think that represents kind of a typical conversation and discovery conversation that we would have with a customer. There's nothing really shocking here. I think this is a lot of the common issues that most customers kind of face. And so what you want to do here is you now should be taking all of that pain that we've identified and being able to go through and collectively sort out what areas of that pain that we're going to uniquely address and that our competition doesn't. And along the way, we kind of flushed out that we're more than likely competing against vCenter or VxRail. So now we can become very targeted in how we do that going forward. And so I recommend that you go through and try to group these things together, kind of highlight the things. We don't want to be able to try to talk about 15 things. We want to land 4 or 5 things that we do very, very well. And that's going to keep that conversation very focused. Now, if we go through and say have a subsequent meeting, where now through previous meetings, we've built a champion, and that champion's now brought us into a conversation with some of the senior managers of operations and the head of IT, or maybe some VPs or C-level execs, depending on the organization. So we're now dealing with the true logical or economic buyers in this meeting. And so in this meeting, you again want to go through and have a conversation with these folks around the pain that they're having. And so this conversation, for this example, goes something like this. We hear that there's really not enough people within those organizations to support what they have. And we heard in the previous conversations that they had people leave the organization. They weren't able to backfill those things. They have no budget to increase the headcount. So they're struggling just to really be able to support everything that they do. Because of that, we heard that those folks are spending a lot of time working evenings and weekends. The issue that this creates for that economic buyer is that now he's having to pay a ton of overtime. And he's always more than 50% over budget for his overtime. In addition to that, he's got constant complaints from his staff of poor work-life balance. That's led to a lot of his senior people actually leaving the organization. As far as the branch offices go, those failures that are happening are actually impacting the business. And so these senior executives are now hearing from those businesses, and they want the issue addressed now. Problem is that they really don't have budget to go and do a wholesale replacement of all that aging infrastructure in the branch offices. We heard issues in terms of, running out of capacity. From the economic buyer perspective, their staff's coming to them with last minute requests, right? There was no budget ever planned for this. And so everything is reactive, and they have no way to immediately address a lot of those things. So there's no visibility into what that looks like from a capacity planning perspective. The other thing that's really hampering them is that a lot of this aging infrastructure, because it's beyond kind of the first 3 or 4 years, the maintenance contracts on those are ever increasing, and they're getting more and more expensive, and that's cost prohibitive in terms of being able to purchase new infrastructure while still trying to maintain the aging storage contracts. So there are definitely huge decisions to make around how they actually utilize their IT spend. From the developer perspective, those developer teams are bypassing his team. They're going directly to the cloud. They have no idea how they're going to match the cloud agility and actually to give the developers what they want. That pressure from upper levels of the organization and from business units to move to the cloud is growing. And now, because all of those different developers are going to, say, AWS, the bills that they're incurring by going to the cloud are now rolling up and hitting the IT cost center. And so that's further contributing to budget issues in terms of taking money away from the money that they desperately need to replace that aging infrastructure. And so based on this, we now know that in addition to vSAN and VxRail, we're also potentially competing against public cloud providers or a movement to a cloud first type of strategy. So at this point in time, we want to do the same thing. We want to be able to go through, kind of highlight the key areas where we think we can make a huge difference for this customer, and really kind of boil that down to 4 or 5 things that we want to address within the environment, and not try to solve all of their problems in the first meeting. So that gives you an idea of how to go in and do proper discovery. What we don't want to be doing is going in and, I think, pitching products, trying to sell them things, try to articulate, the various things within our portfolio that may be of interest to them. That's not the right way to start conversations, and it's going to be a similar conversation to what all of our competition is using. So going in and having a very deep conversation with that customer about the pain that they're having within their environments will set up the next sets of conversations around how we're actually able to uniquely address that pain. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section.